Get started. Good evening. My name is Adam Bronstein. I'm the Oregon Director with Western Watersheds Project. Our mission is to protect and restore Western watersheds and wildlife through education, public policy initiatives, and legal advocacy. We have a particular focus on the negative effects of public lands livestock grazing. I'm excited to be hosting our webinar this evening, Wolves in the Livestock Industry. So once we get through all of our presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box. That's where you can type in your questions. And then I will read them on air, so to speak, and our panelists will answer them. If you want to direct them towards a particular panelist, please make sure you say that in your message. As settlers expanded into the frontier in the 19th and early 20th century, wolves were seen as a threat to cattle and sheep and thus became targets of aggressive eradication campaigns. Ranchers, often supported by government bounties and federal predator control programs, poisoned, trapped, and shot wolves en masse. By the 1930s, gray wolves had nearly been wiped out across the lower 48. This extermination was driven not only by economic concerns over livestock losses, but also by a cultural hostility towards predators that were standing in the way of a campaign of Western domestication and manifest destiny. Wolves continue to face persecution and death at the behest of the livestock industry all across the West and in states like Montana, Oregon, and Idaho. Our first presentation tonight is by Erik Molvar, Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project. This presentation is called Our Nation's Dysfunctional Approach to Wolves. Welcome, Erik, and why don't you go ahead and share your screen?
Well, thank you very much, and we'll go ahead and start the slideshow here for folks. So my name is Erik Molvar. I'm the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project, and Western Watersheds Project has been doing quite a bit on wolves, including being the author of a petition to relist wolves in Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, which was denied under the Biden administration and which we are currently litigating in federal court. We'll go ahead and get started. We're going to talk this evening about America's dysfunctional approach to wolves. And let's start from the beginning. At the time of first European contact, there were an estimated 2 million wolves across North America, 380,000 of them living in the Western United States and Mexico. And that's based on genetic studies. At the same time, there were 55 million bison, 45 million mule deer, 10 million elk, and 2 million bighorn sheep. And all of this was in the context of indigenous habitation of North America. So this was the previous administration's wildlife management and wolf management policies. And we had more game animals back then than any white person has seen since. And so that just tells you that the kind of wildlife management that you saw under indigenous habitation of North America was a lot more sustainable and a lot more focused on coexistence than we have today. And if you look at the original range of wolves, you'll ignore the cross-hatching, which is the original range of coyotes, but the dark gray and the light gray is the original range of wolves across North America prior to European settlement. And during that time, wolves were pretty much everywhere across the continent. And you'll note here that states like Nevada were fully occupied by wolves. Today, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service likes to claim that Nevada is unsuitable as wolf habitat, but the wolves didn't think so back before white administration. And upon the arrival of the European colonists, when they landed on our shores, they brought with them a lot of baggage. And some of the baggage included European folk tales that were really designed to teach young children how to be afraid and cautious in front of strangers. And in these folk tales, they're more allegories than anything else. And the wolf represented that which was dangerous or strange or fearful. And you look at the fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood, the Three Little Pigs. The wolf it's always the big bad wolf, and that's always the antagonist in the story and the dangerous thing to be avoided. And so that seeped into the culture and serves as sort of a backdrop for all of the policies that flowed from European colonization. And once the United States got its independence, it embarked upon a policy of manifest destiny. And the argument was it was the manifest destiny of the United States and its settlers to travel all the way west to the Pacific shore and control and dominate all of that land. And this is a painting that was done by John Gast in 1872 called American Progress. And it kind of embodies that manifest destiny philosophy in which nature is something to be cleared away. It's all about taming the wilderness. It's about conquering the wild creatures and driving them away. It's about pushing aside the native wildlife, the native indigenous people, and making the land productive for agricultural use. And so this is fundamentally rooted, I think, also in religious background in the Judeo-Christian tradition. If you look at the book of Genesis, when creation happened, humans were given the dominion over the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And this led to a philosophy of what's called dominionism, in which it is mankind, and it's mankind usually, not female kind, but it's mankind is there to dominate nature and suppress nature and turn nature into something that serves our interests and our profitability. And so that's the philosophy that's kind of shown on the left of this diagram, that anthropocentric view of things where humans, and particularly male humans, are to dominate everything else, and other species have some kind of status only to the extent that they are useful or profitable for people. And to the right, you see the ecocentric viewpoint that is more aligned with the original indigenous inhabitants, in which the idea was to coexist with all the other species, maintain your life in balance with the natural world. And I think that philosophy is very much more conducive to living with wolves in a way that is non-hostile and non-lethal on both sides. And it's interesting to note that the indigenous people, there were 5 million of them estimated on the North American continent. This wasn't just a few people out there in a vast wilderness. And yet they were living together with a vast and abundant biodiversity in a very successful way. So this is something that I think we turned away from as a nation when we relegated those cultures to reservations and replaced their cultures and their economies with ours. As far as wolves were concerned, the first big hit the wolf populations took were from the fur industry. And the fur traders and trappers came across the West. They were mainly trapping for beaver, but they also trapped for wolves as well. And their pelts were used for things like the ruffs of parkas. And so that's the first economic exploitation of wolves. And that started probably in the 1700s. And then as the Western agriculturalists came and homesteaded the arid West, they started getting rid of wolves as a means to clear the way for cattle and sheep, which are very poorly adapted to survive and live out in wild, arid landscapes and are vulnerable to predators. Now, these are animals that naturally or unnaturally humans have domesticated and have selected in order to be tractable, in order to be dim-witted, in order to be easy for us to process. And so those same traits make them vulnerable to wolves. And the livestock industry did its best to eradicate wolves informally throughout the 1800s, often relying on local bounties in which $5 or $10 or $25 might be offered for the hide or a tail of a wolf. And even the U.S. Army in its official capacity was involved in wolf eradication. In 1872, when Yellowstone National Park was established, the U.S. Army was given control of it because there was no Park Service back then. And the bison and the elk, this was one of the last refuges for those species. And in order to protect those species from poachers, the U.S. Army was also engaged in an eradication campaign against wolves, against mountain lions and other predators that were potentially going to take these species that were in their last remnants in Yellowstone. So that the U.S. Army and the national park was actually part of the eradication of wolves. And then by 1915, it became official U.S. government policy to appropriate taxpayer funding to kill wolves. In 1924, the Division of Predatory Animal and Rodent Control was established, and then was really codified in 1931 with the Animal Damage Control Act. In 1974, this changed to animal damage control, and then later, much later, it became USDA Wildlife Services. I think that was in the 1980s. So anyway, this is an agency that is basically the livestock industry's death squad, that the industry can go forth and say, we're going to call upon you. We're having problems with wolves preying on our sheep or preying on our calves. We're going to call you to kill these quote unquote problem wolves. And you can see in the bottom of this slide, hundreds of wolves have been killed every year by USDA Wildlife Services. And so this is a very deadly activity that you, the taxpayer, are actually paying for, whenever you pay your taxes. And it's for the livestock industry's benefit. Now, again, if you look at the historic range of wolves, and in this slide that's shown in the light gray, as of 2020, the current range of wolves is much, much smaller. And when you hear the livestock industry or the trophy hunting lobby say that wolves are fully recovered, you can see that there are 39 states where wolves were historically present, where they're not present anymore. And so the wolf is a long way from being recovered. And so it's premature to delist them on that basis. And here's a little bit of an updated map for California. This is the February map showing that there are now, I think, 7 packs that are named in California. But in California, they have additional state protections under the California Endangered Species Acts, which really precludes killing of wolves in almost all circumstances. And so this is the state where they have the most protections. But in many other states, the protections are much weaker. And I want to pause for a moment and note that in the 21st century, today, we have returned to the bounty as a way to get rid of wolves. And there is an outfit called the Foundation for Wildlife Management, which, as a wildlife biologist, I can tell you has nothing to do with wildlife management. It's all about killing wolves. And they are offering $1,000 to $2,000 per wolf in Idaho and in Montana. And the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is one of the organizations that's providing the funding, as well as the Idaho legislature. So in Wyoming, this is one of the states that has one of the worst types of wolf management problems, in as much as wolves are managed as predatory animals in 86% of the state. And this is an extermination zone where there's an open season on wolf killing year round, where there's no bag limit, no limit on methods that you can use. You can even run over them with snowmobiles. It's perfectly legal. And so basically, the wolves are only officially permitted to inhabit the 14% of the state that is Yellowstone National Park and the little wilderness areas surrounding Yellowstone. And even in those wilderness areas, wolves are treated as a trophy game species where they have a bag limit and a hunting season every year. And it's important to note that in 2004, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned by the state of Wyoming to delist wolves across the state. And the state of Wyoming had this exact same wolf management plan, and the Fish and Wildlife Service found that having a predatory animal zone across the vast majority of the state, all of which is suitable wildlife or suitable wolf habitat, is insufficient to be an adequate regulatory mechanism under the Endangered Species Act. And then much later, it reversed itself. and caved into the political pressure and then did delist wolves after there was a wolf rider that was passed through Congress. Importantly, it's not just a problem for Wyoming wolves, this wolf management in Wyoming. Whenever wolves were released in Colorado to repopulate that state, the wolves being protected under the ESA in Colorado sometimes drifted across the Colorado state line, sometimes were actively lured across the state line by hunters broadcasting very loud game distress calls on loudspeakers to lure the wolves across the line and shoot them. And this was investigated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and nothing was done about it. So the policies of wolves in Wyoming, where wolves are completely unprotected, are harming the Colorado reintroduction effort. And that's intentional. It's important to point to, I think, the incident in February of 2024, where Cody Roberts ran over a wolf with a snowmobile, disabling it, and then dragged that wolf with his mouth taped shut into a bar in Daniel, Wyoming, in order to take selfies and brag to his friends before taking it out back and shooting it. He was penalized a fine of only $250 for illegal possession of a wild wolf, even though $1,000 penalties were available to law enforcement. It was very disappointing. And Cody Roberts himself publicly scoffed at the penalties that he received. It was illuminating to see what the livestock industry had to say. Their leading lobbyist, Jim Magagna, said, quote, "I've talked with a number of livestock producers across the state, in particular sheep producers, who have said that they view it, which is snowmobile whacking, of wolves, as one of their most effective tools." So this is the state of quote unquote civilization in Wyoming. It's kind of a failed state. There was a bill in the legislature, House Bill 275, that was passed this March. It did increase penalties for this kind of wildlife torture, including a felony for a second offense, but it has some problematic language that might make it hard to enforce. And there was a run on making snowmobile whacking illegal in this legislation, and the legislature explicitly decided not to include a prohibition on running over wolves with snowmobiles, if you can believe it or not. Idaho is doing its best to try and keep up with Wyoming in the race to the bottom. Originally in Idaho, the Nez Perce tribe was involved in the wolf reintroduction, and it had a cooperative management role in the Idaho wolf recovery for quite some time. That was terminated by the state in 2016, and it's been downhill on wolf recovery in Idaho ever since. Hunters and trappers under Idaho state law can purchase an unlimited number of wolf tags. There's year-round wolf hunting and trapping on private lands, although there was a ruling in a case that was led by Earth Justice that prohibits wolf trapping on public lands and private lands for 9 months of the year across most of the state. And that was a case where I think WWP, I think maybe Sierra Club, and I think IWCN also were all plaintiffs in that case. And so that gave the wolves some relief from at least trapping, because the judge ruled that it was illegal to expose grizzly bears to the risk of wolf trapping during the months when they're out of their dens wandering around, because there's a likelihood that grizzly bears could be either harmed or killed. The state of Idaho offers no restrictions on night vision scopes or shooting from vehicles or snowmobiles, hunting over bait, hunting with hounds. It's all legal. And they appropriate hundreds of thousands of dollars each year to kill wolves in different ways. Some of that taxpayer funding goes to the wolf bounties that Foundation for Wildlife Management puts out. The state target for wolf population is 500 animals. That's far below the minimum viable population for the state of Idaho. And it's also known that the Idaho wolf population model has some serious biases in it that causes the state of Idaho to overestimate how many wolves are in the state. And this is pretty critical, because if you're trying to manage the wolves down to 500 animals and you think you've got 1,500 wolves, but you've really only got 700 or 800, then the amount of take that you authorize could push wolves to the brink of extinction. Montana is not that much better than Idaho. There's a trapping season that now goes now is prohibited from January 1st to February 15th due to a Wild Earth Guardians legal win. They have a target statewide population set to 450 animals. They have a pretty aggressive trophy hunting season. Hunters in Montana can use night vision equipment on private property to hunt wolves. There's a 6-month hunting and trapping season with up to 20 wolf tags per person allowed for hunting, 10 for hunting and 10 for trapping. And Foundation for Wildlife Management has moved into Montana with $1,000 wolf bounties as well. Just like Idaho, Montana has a very suspect wolf population estimation model, and that's problematic in terms of, do you have as many wolves out there as you think you have? I think it's important to point to the state's promotion of this idea that we have to kill wolves in order to promote social tolerance. And their social theory is based on the idea that, well, if we let these rural communities kill a few wolves, then they'll be much more likely to accept the remaining wolves out there. But what we're finding is that the more wolves these states, these rural Western states, are allowed to kill, the more they want to kill, the more different methods they want to eradicate the wolves in their jurisdictions. There is science, and that's the citation that I provided here at the bottom, that shows that in the upper Midwest, when wolf ESA listing was rescinded for a time and trophy hunting was allowed, the amount of illegal wolf killing or poaching actually increased. So instead of the hunters feeling like they have their outlet to kill a few wolves and then leaving the rest of them alone, the amount of illegal wolf killing also increased along with the amount of permitted hunting under the hunting season. The other proof that that social tolerance isn't achieved through killing wolves comes from Yellowstone National Park. This is the place in the West that has the greatest social tolerance for wolves. Trophy hunters go to Yellowstone. Ranchers go to Yellowstone. They coexist 100% non-lethally with wolves within the boundaries of the national park, precisely because federal law prohibits killing wolves. That's how you get social tolerance, not by allowing some wolves to be killed, but by placing an entire moratorium on wolf killing. So what are the solutions to these problematic situations? Well, first, we need to have a nationwide relisting of gray wolves under the ESA so that we don't have trophy hunting, trapping, illegal take or take of wolves becomes illegal. And ultimately, the Tribal Heritage and American Bison, Grizzly Bear, and Wolf Restoration and Coexistence Act, which Senator Booker has sponsored, would place wolves on a similar footing with bald and golden eagles, where people just aren't allowed to kill them or even possess their parts unless they're tribal members and doing it for a legitimate purpose. We also need to change our mythology and our folk tales around wolves. What we're teaching our children really matters. And we need to rewild the continent. And if that rewilding of the continent allows the wolves to come back, this is a painting called Reversing Manifest Destiny by Charles Hilliard Secoagan, who is a Chippewa. And it shows the idea that the indigenous people can lead us in returning to a more coexistence-based way of looking at wolves. And so that's my presentation, and I'll hand it to the next presenter.
Okay, thanks, Erik. It looks like Julian was able to join us. So the rest of you folks, if you could limit your time to 10 minutes, and I'll try to pop back on. Julian, if you could share your screen. Julian Matthews, co-founder of Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment, and his presentation is titled The Nimiipuu and the Ties We Have with Wolves in Nez Perce History and Culture. Julian, are you there? Okay, well, let's move on to Suzanne Asha Stone, Executive Director of International Wildlife Coexistence Network. And her presentation is What Are Wolves Telling Us About Western Livestock Practices? Welcome, Suzanne.
Hey, thank you. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be among you guys tonight. So uh, we're going to focus on talking about wolves and livestock. Um, my name is Suzanne Asha Stone. I'm the executive director of the International Wildlife Coexistence Network, but I'm also the co-founder of the Wood River Wolf Project, which is the longest running wolf and livestock non-lethal coexistence study, probably, well, certainly in the country, probably in North America, and possibly even beyond that. We have about 20,000 sheep in our project area, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we live, provide coexistence and protection for both wolves and livestock there. But I know that we also wanted to talk about just the history and some of the pressures that occur with wolves on the landscape. I would say that I'm based in Idaho, that Idaho actually out of the 3 states in the Northern Rockies is not only the worst state to be because to be a wolf, because our wolves have zero protection. They're under basically a predator status statewide in about 99% of the state. I think there's only about 450, 60 square miles where wolves are not being trapped um, and killed routinely. And it's become probably one of the most disappointing parts about having wolves return to the Northern Rockies. Idaho had the largest wolf population at one point. We were close to 2,000 wolves in the state, and the state of Idaho's wolves were responsible for securing recovery of wolves in Washington, Oregon, and California. And now are probably, we're expecting that population has dwindled potentially within a few hundred, maybe a few more than that. The bottom line for the state of Idaho is 150 wolves. So it is just an ongoing process challenge to keep wolves alive here after they have left protection of the Endangered Species Act. So we focus a lot on sheep because in the Northern Rockies and beyond, usually if there's an option between sheep and cattle, wolves tend to kill more sheep. Everything tends to kill more sheep of all the animals that are predated on, especially our national forest lands. Sheep are the one that come in at the very top because they're absolutely the most vulnerable on the landscape, far more so than cattle. And there tends to be operations that go with herders across the landscape, whereas with cattle, you often see them in areas where they're basically untended, which makes them a lot more vulnerable to predators than they should be. But because there's typically a time when they turn them off onto the national forest lands, and it can be days, weeks, months between the time that the livestock owner actually leaves the livestock out there and then sees them again or checks in on them. It just really depends on the operators and what their permit is with the National Forest and BLM. We all kind of probably grew up a bit with this image of the rancher on their landscape. In my family, we had pretty deep roots in Texas with both cattle and with horse ranching there. And this romantic view of wolves of ranchers on the landscape was one that I certainly grew up with. But what I found is that, especially working with wolves across the Western United States, is that there's a really big difference between ranchers who are stewards of land and those that are just basically using livestock as their business. And so, we've really encountered the full gamut of ranchers and their attitudes towards predators, some being very, very harsh. And I think we need to start talking about the ranching industry, especially given the time and amount of funding that we spend as a nation to allow them to ranch on our federal public lands for almost free. It's very inexpensive for them to be there. It's cost more for us to go camping basically for a night than it does for them to have a cow and calf pair out there for a month or up to 6 sheep. But we need to start talking about the other aspects of the ranching industry that aren't so great and why that is. We all know that there's a lot of handling of the livestock, and I'm going to warn you guys that there's a few of these slides that are a little bit graphic. So if you don't want to watch them, feel free to avert your eyes, but I want to give you that warning too. We know that these livestock are often, brought together after sometimes being months out in the open range to fend for themselves, typically, and then placed in these big, large 18-wheeler trucks, taken to the slaughterhouses. And it's just a really brutal kind of system or business when it's done in this kind of capacity where you're just looking at the end product of being what you are serving to the American people, right? So when you only treat it as that kind of a business and there's not a compassion or a stewardship responsibility to the land, it really separates the people who are really great stewards and those who are really there to just, you know, remove the land from predators, remove predators from the land because they see them as a risk or a threat and just want to eliminate all those risks and threats that are out there. We've seen intense killing of wolves in places like Idaho, where it's not just one or two wolves that are being killed, it's entire packs that are being destroyed, the bounties that are on them. I really never thought I would live to see in my lifetime the return of bounties and these archaic type practices that are occurring. And wolves are being caught up in this 365 days of the year. The bounties are for pups in the den, as well as for the adult wolves, and literally thousands of dollars going into that. That foundation that for wildlife management that is started and runs the bounty program started off with maybe 150 members and a few $100,000, and now they're well over in the $1 million category in terms of their funding and their attempt to expand not only from Idaho and Montana. They tried in Wyoming. There's not a bounty program in Wyoming, and then they've most recently been working to try to get seeded into Colorado and into California and other states as well. But it doesn't have to be like this, right? We know this because we know that there are other ways that we can approach coexisting with these species. One of them is the Wood River Wolf Project that we run here in central Idaho. We started that project essentially in 2007 and became formal in 2008. And we've had consistent wolf packs there. We're using non-lethal measures over that 18 now years of working on this project. We've had on average about 20,000 sheep in our project area, and less than 5 sheep a year are killed by wolves. And we've also seen a massive reduction of sheep losses to other predators, even though we're doing this in one of the most rugged places in the Western United States on public lands. And it is not only successful, it's actually more cost effective to do it this way rather than trying to kill off every single wolf or bear or mountain lion coyote that's out there. We did it by bringing the community together. So we've got livestock owners, community advocates, agencies sitting down at the table and working to develop these plans on how we work together, how we are successful. The last 2 years of the project, we've had 0 losses. So we're really happy with how well this system has been working. We have field crew out there with the sheep pretty much from the time the sheep hit the range over about a 460 square mile area. And they spend their entire summer starting end of May or so till the early October out there on the landscape. We are monitoring for wolves and trying to determine, the best packs. The packs that are most easy to work with are the ones that are the most stable. So by protecting wolves from being killed, it really helps us also protect livestock. And that's not a message that you see commonly occurring in places like Colorado, where wolves and livestock have become such a contentious and polarized issue. We have a volunteer citizens group that works a lot with students. I mean, there's lots of positive ways that the community can get involved in things like this. But it really takes having that attitude of, do we want this Old West brutality happening on our public lands, especially when biodiversity is in such a rapid, steep decline? Or do we want to have wolves and mountain lions and bears and in healthy populations of these animals across the landscape in a way that honors that land, the ecosystem resiliency, and the will of the people? And I think that the answer is really the latter. So thank you again for letting me participate tonight.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. Julian, are you available? Can you hear me? He might, let's see. Julian, are you able to unmute? Okay, well, he's signed in. He must be having technical difficulties. Well, Nick, let's go to you, and I'm going to run your slides. So let me share my screen.
Great. I'll just get started while you're bringing that up, Adam. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Nick Gevock. I'm a campaign organizer on Northern Rockies wildlands and wildlife for the Sierra Club. And I certainly don't have as pretty of a presentation as the two before me, but I'm really glad Erik went before me because it really lays out what I want to talk about and what I've seen. I have been in Montana for 26 years, both as a journalist and then working in wildlife conservation. And throughout that time, I first moved to Montana in 1998 for graduate school, just a few years after the reintroduction of wolves. And it was certainly in the news quite a bit. And if you can go back to the first slide, Adam, this is the fifth one. I'm just going to rip through really quick how I watched the wolf debate play out in Montana. We all know about the reintroduction effort of wolves into Montana and into Yellowstone National Park, that is, and central Idaho in the mid 1990s. And you know that was really a historic reintroduction because as we started to put wildlife back in place on this continent, of course, a lot of that effort was led by hunters, and they started with ungulate species. And of course, we had to have that prey base in place to be successful with um, bringing back a native carnivore species like wolves and bears and mountain lions were never endangered, but were getting close in the 1970s. But anyway, after the 95 and 96 reintroductions of wolves, there was a period where there were intensive monitoring of their populations until about 2004 when they had met those bare minimum numbers that were laid out at the reintroduction. And those numbers were 150 wolves in each of the 3 states and 15 breeding pairs. And of course, the states started their efforts to delist and take over management, and each of them had to have an approved wolf management plan. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approved Idaho's, approved Montana's. They acknowledged there would be hunting, but they had these certain measures to make sure it wasn't extreme efforts to try to drive wolf numbers down to bare minimum numbers. So, and then when we got to 2009, wolves were delisted under the Obama administration in Montana and Idaho because they had acceptable plans. Wyoming was left behind, as Erik touched on, because its plan was not acceptable, because it had that predator zone. And in Montana that year, the state said, we're going to have a wolf hunt, but we're going to keep it reasonable. And it set a quota of 75 wolves statewide. And that year, they had a wolf hunt, no trapping. They had a wolf hunt. They killed 76 wolves the day they went one over when they hit the quota. And then wolves went back on the endangered species list through litigation in 2010, no wolf hunting season. And then, of course, wolves were the only species delisted by Congress in 2011 with a budget rider on the National Defense Authorization Act. Montana had a hunt again that year, started to up the quotas, but maintain them and take a look every year. And somewhat, there was still a lot of pressure from certain interests to increase the hunting methods, the season dates, the bag limit, all of that. And in 2013, there was a bill passed that really laid out the parameters that Montana's hunting would include. It was a bag limit of up to 5 per year. It was, but it also maintained, for example, a 24-hour waiting periods for anybody with a wolf license. That was to ensure people wouldn't go kill a wolf and then go buy the license retroactively. It had a whole bunch of measures. I can't get the bill number, but I was actually there at the time when the governor signed the bill. At the time, I was the conservation director for the Montana Wildlife Federation, and that bill was really sort of laid out the parameters that we would have in Montana. Some people thought we were maybe killing way too many wolves. Some people thought we weren't killing enough. But what that led to was an 8-year sort of détente where the wolf wars were effectively over in Montana. And I know that because when it came around to the season setting at meetings where there used to be 50, 60, 80 people there, and no one showed up to comment on the wolf season. And that all changed in 2021 when we had a significant political shift in Montana. Now, and I want to say that while that was going on in Montana, we watched what was happening in Idaho with the baiting and the night vision and the bounties and the 12-month season and all of these measures, and literally writing into state statute that we are going to try to get down to an absolute bare minimum number, but not put them back on the endangered species list. And I think that's an important point. And in the 2021 Montana legislature, we passed a series of bills that implemented those methods, all of it, the night vision, and they just kept going with more and more bills. And in fact, as we speak right now, there are bills pending in the Montana legislature, which is in session right now, to continue to try to get down to that bare minimum number. And I think that just shows. I heard for years, if we can just manage them, if we can just have a reasonable wolf hunt, all of this will go away. And what I have realized is that that's just not true. And what this image I brought up here is really to see that the exact same thing is taking place right now in the state of Colorado, where via ballot initiative, the people of Colorado said, we want to do, I thought it was very historic, a state-based reintroduction of a species. That passed in the 2020 election. And just over a year ago, they did it after careful planning, all of these measures, and they released like 10 wolves in sort of northwestern Colorado, or just and I am watching the exact same debate and discussion play out in the state of Colorado. And it's really being driven by the livestock industry. And this is my slide here that I had up. They're coming in with mass claims in their livestock loss program. And candidly, the goal is to break the program. I mean, we hear all this rhetoric about, well, we could live with them, but we want to see them managed. But the truth is, they don't want to live with them. And they will not stop until they eradicate the species. It is a repeat of history, and I think it's disgraceful. And, it really does tie back to the incredible political lobby of the livestock industry. And in fact, we have, as I'm glad I followed Suzanne too, because there are models that work to coexist with these species. If you look at the losses to wolves in the livestock industry, it is a fraction of the losses that livestock producers suffer from all other causes, whether it's disease or lightning or all kinds of things where they lose livestock. And the fact is, that every business suffers loss. The livestock industry is no different. And so that's what I have. And I just want to say that the other thing is when you hear it from the sporting community, I personally am a deer and elk hunter. We actually, in the state of Wyoming, they are culling elk right now in many areas. And in fact, we have a bill pending in the Montana legislature to start elk culling. So there's this certain amount of doublespeak going on about too many wolves and too many elk. And the last thing I'll just say is we're talking about wolves here, but they want to bring this exact model to grizzly bears right now and manage for an absolute bare minimum number of them on the landscape. So that's kind of what I have. And, I think it's a sad day because I think wolf recovery was a great conservation success in our country to see us bring back an apex carnivore species like that. It was continuing to rebuild the pyramid of wildlife that we had eradicated on this continent. And I think it's really sad that we're seeing this happen, but it is the reality we are facing right now. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Julian, you want to give it one more shot? If you can unmute and turn your camera on. All right. Well, thanks for that presentation, Nick and Erik and Suzanne. So we'll go to the questions here. We've got a bunch of them. I just have a quick question, and I heard this from Suzanne earlier. How many livestock were either killed or injured in Idaho last year?
Yeah, we just saw the U.S. DA Wildlife Services report at the January, I believe, Idaho Wolf Depredation Control Board meeting. And in the last fiscal year for Wildlife Services, which runs July 1st through June 30th, they reported 11 cattle, which were cows and calves, 11 cattle out of 1.2 million cattle in the state that were killed or injured by wolves in that year. 11 cattle. And I think the losses to sheep were about 3 times that. So they were closer to 30 sheep in the state out of 240,000. But I mean, statistically, it's almost too little to count. And yeah, so it's not the livestock that's driving this, at least not the livestock losses that are driving these conflicts over wolves.
And Montana was like somewhere in the 20s, if I recall. So it's a similar story there too, huh? All right, well let's pose the first question. So this is for anyone who'd like to take it. Hi, thank you for your presentations. 2 questions. Why are wolves so important to biodiversity and ecosystems? And why don't more ranchers practice coexistence with wolves and carnivores when the benefits for coexistence are so apparent?
I can take the second part. Does anybody want to jump on the biodiversity question?
Well, sure, I can try and address that. One of the really interesting things is that wolves are an apex predator and they exert influence on the landscape, not just by direct loss of the animals they prey on, but also by changing the prey behavior. So there's been a big body of more than 45 studies in Yellowstone National Park that have shown the existence of what's called a trophic cascade. And what that means is that the predatory behavior of the wolves in the park is chasing the elk out of the open valley bottoms and up into the timber. And as a result, you have less elk browsing on the willows and the aspens and other species. And as a result, it has changed the riparian vegetation in Yellowstone in a positive direction, allowing willows to recover. It's allowed beavers to recover. It's allowed songbirds to recover. It's had a cascading effect on the entire ecosystem that's really important. I think it's important to note that apex predators have no natural predators, so there's really no, call to manage them. There's no need to manage them. So go ahead, Suzanne, if you'd like to take the second question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure would add also, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, but chronic wasting disease is an issue that is hitting us hard across the Western United States. And I mean, I just saw reports even heading up towards Alaska that it was being detected. It's just amazing how far it's going, and there's no cure for it, right? There is also the opportunity that it can jump over into other types of animals, potentially even humans. It's probably the biggest threat to elk, deer, and moose, certainly across the Northern Rockies. And that's another thing that the wolves fill, that as a niche, that they are probably the best anti-chronic wasting disease control, because they are the ones that are taking these weakened animals and eliminating them at the time when they're the most contagious in the population, when they're demonstrating the characteristics in late stage chronic wasting disease. So another major role that wolves fill. Why aren't more ranchers adopting these methods? Some are, and the trend is moving, had been moving in that direction. But I think it's that we have set up a government program to reward people for maintaining the status quo, for doing exactly what they've done for generations. And that is, there's more benefit to the ranchers to not change, because they can pick up their cell phone and call to have predators eradicated when they think they're having a problem with them. And the federal government, using our tax dollars, will go in and eliminate that problem. That's been happening for generations now. We need the incentives to be on the other side. We need the incentives to be in the places where only compensation would be offered if ranchers are using non-lethal proactive measures. That's a requirement in states like especially early phases in Oregon, Washington, and certainly California, but not in the other states. So it's really counterproductive. That it's just the system that's driving us is trying to hang on to this archaic, let's kill predators first and then not ask questions later.
Okay, thanks. With this administration in charge, what hope is there for repopulation?
I'll jump in, and not a lot. I think you're going to need wolves to be at least in your most remote backcountry areas of the states to have any level of protection. And even there in the state of Idaho, they're getting shot at times from helicopters in wilderness areas, which is just lunacy. So it's going to be a rough go for a few years.
I think that's true, but I'd like to offer a little bit of a sunnier outlook, which is that we've seen this before with the first Trump administration, and they tried to delist wolves, and we stopped them in the courts. And then when we got the Biden administration, they appealed when we won. They kept that legal appeal alive. So the policies on wolves weren't that different under Biden than they were under Trump, and the wolves have expanded. But it is going to take continued litigation, and there's a very real danger that with the supermajority in Congress that the Republicans have right now, that they're going to be able to push through some legislation to get around the wins in the court.
Could you update us as to whether there's anything we can do to fight the Boebert bill that is now on the floor? I'm assuming that's the ESA gutting bill.
I'll take that. Yeah, I mean, our best hope obviously is in the U.S. Senate, where we do still have the filibuster. And we will be working hard to just shore up at least the Democrats, honestly, to resist that bill. And it's interesting that Representative Boebert is bringing this, because there was just a hearing 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago on these experimental populations of animals, and she was directing all of her anger at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Colorado's wolf reintroduction was a state-led effort. Again, I bring that up, and that was very historic. And the people of Colorado, by ballot initiative, said this is something we want. So, but as far as the Boebert bill, yeah, I think the Senate's our best backstop. Certainly, we're gonna fight it and say that people want to see continued wolf recovery in the United States.
When will the various conservation groups collaborate to organize a nationwide boycott campaign of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming? It's becoming clear that without these financial pressure, these states will not change course.
I'll just say I agree that it always is helpful to hit people with the buck, but the fact is we still live in a pretty spectacular place in the Northern Rockies, and a boycott is only effective if people don't show up, and people still want to come to see the world's first national park, and not just that, but glacier and central Idaho, and float the rivers and enjoy these spectacular natural resources. So while I understand the sentiment there, it's pretty hard to do.
Is there any way to extinguish grazing permits on national forest land?
Well, there have been, WWP has what's called the Sagebrush Fund, which is in the business of trying to acquire grazing permits by voluntary buyout. In places where there's congressional authorization to permanently close those grazing permits, and we have that in the Boulder White Clouds in central Idaho and the Owyhee Canyon lands of southwestern Idaho, then that becomes a much safer bet. We have also bought out grazing permits in the Bridger Teton of northwestern Wyoming. And in that area, there is no such permanent closure. And we bought those out based on the forest supervisor's promise that those would never be a priority to reopen those and restock those allotments once we bought out those permits, because you can't actually keep the permit and not graze the cattle. The agencies won't let you do that. So we had to give the permits back to the agency. They promised us that they would never restock them. And before you know it, you had the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and the Wyoming Department of Livestock jumping in the Forest Service's offices and saying, hey, here's $200,000 that the legislature has appropriated to reopen those grazing permits and restock them with cattle and sheep and reinitiate those conflicts that we had avoided by buying out those grazing permits from the willing sellers. So it's just not safe to do. There is a bill called the Voluntary Grazing Permit Retirement Act that Adam Smith is the sponsor of in the House. But it seems like it's a long shot right now in this Congress to get it done. But that's what's really needed is federal legislation that authorizes the permanent closure so that the conservation groups that have the money to buy out grazing permits are willing to spend it. And instead of risking it on buying out grazing permits that might just be given right back to the ranchers.
And can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
So if we weren't eating beef, we wouldn't need to buy out the grazing permits. If we weren't eating beef as a nation, we wouldn't need to worry about predator control. It really comes down to everybody that is a consumer, because trying to go up against the livestock industry, we'd actually scale back. Most livestock is not grazed on public lands, but if a national campaign that you were talking about, that boycott, were targeted at beef, we would find ourselves pretty quickly, I think, allied with beef producers in other parts of the country who would help us in terms of pushing back on what's happening on our federal public lands, because they don't want to see consumers walk away from their product. And so I think we have to start looking at, the consumption that we have, and Americans consume more beef, I think, than any other country in the world. It is, it's not sustainable. We look at mammalian biomass across the world, and humans represent 96%. Humans, our livestock, and our pets represent 96% of all of that biomass, mammals across the world. At least 4% for the wild ones left. I mean, we are losing biodiversity at an enormous rate. There's all kinds of reasons for us to do this, but ultimately it's the consumer that's driving this, just like it is, the drug user that is pushing the drug industry and supporting it. We have to get past that and really look at our own diets.
Very good. We seem to have an insufferable problem in Wyoming with the lobbying heft of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and long-timers like Jim Magagna. Any suggestions for how wolf advocates can undercut that influence in lobbying the legislature?
I'll take that up. I don't think you can. I don't think in Wyoming you're going to do it in your legislature. But, we have this amazing new agency in the federal government called the Doge. And I think we need to start talking raw economics. I mean, they talk about underperforming assets. The American taxpayer is getting 6% of market rates for grass on public land. And yet we call our public lands an underperforming asset. We have, I mean, if you look at sheep producers, they get wool subsidies. Their mutton is bought up for the school lunch program. They're getting grass at 6% of market rates, and they have this agency called Wildlife Services, which its annual report to Congress is a body count of all the stuff it killed. And I think you need to talk economics. I do. I mean, how much public money should we spend to keep these people in business? And at what cost to our public lands and wildlife? And because there are models, and we'll probably get into that with another question of where ranchers are coexisting, not just Suzanne's, but in Montana, and not just with gray wolves, but with grizzly bears, which are challenging as well. So, but I think you need to talk economics straight up.
And I would add that, if you had federal protections, whether that's coming through the Endangered Species Act or some other law that prevents the killing of wolves, and that would be something that has been successful in limiting the Wyoming legislature from killing all the wolves in the past. And reinstituting that, I think it is a major priority. If you leave it up to the states, and that's what the Boebert bill does, it basically strips away the federal protections and leaves it to the states and how they want to manage their wolves, then all of the states that are dominated by wolf-hating politics, and that includes many of the Western states, are going to go with this maximum eradication policy. So these are, states like Wyoming, and I lived there for 24 years. I mean, it's a dark place, and they need adult supervision, and that means federal oversight.
What can we do to keep Foundation for Wildlife Management out of our states? They are causing trouble along with Howl for Wildlife here in California now.
I would start with a really good investigative journalist or probably legal investigator. I'm amazed that nobody has really taken a deep look at this organization yet. And I think we need to be asking where not only the money's coming from, but how it's being spent. And in what kind of relationship that they're having with the state governments. Where's that influence? I mean, it's a nonprofit organization. As a nonprofit, we're restricted to certain things. And I think we need to start taking a really close look at an organization that has, just had its, especially in Idaho, free range on mandating wolf policy here in the state. So yeah, there's lots of things we can be doing, but it's making people more aware and finding out more details about these organizations. That's where I would start.
I'm just going to add this is one oddity, but the Foundation for Wildlife Management has no presence in the state of Wyoming, which in fact they tried to get a foothold there, and for whatever reason they don't. Why? I don't know. I think because Wyoming already has the most extreme management plan that allows them to manage for this bare minimum number, but even the sporting interests there kept them out. It's kind of an oddity, but I agree with Suzanne. Again, it comes down to the buck and just the regressive nature of bounties. I mean, that is such a 1800s approach to wildlife management. It's disgraceful. That speaks of an eradication policy, and it has no place in the 21st century.
Now that the former Montana Director of Ag has been made head of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, what are your thoughts on what this means for not only wolves, but all wildlife in the state?
I suppose as the Montana resident, I should jump in there. I don't know. Shockingly, one of the wolf bills that I mentioned pending right now in the Montana legislature, the Gianforte administration came out against it, and in fact, its department. So again, I think there is a little bit of tiring in Montana of this continued, like, here we are coming back again. And in fact, our ag groups have not come in on these bills. When I talk about that détente that had been reached in Montana, you don't see the Montana Farm Bureau Federation or the Stock Growers Association coming in on this stuff. So I don't know how Director Clark, I don't think she has much of an appetite for this. I do think much higher priority is grizzly bear delisting, which is one of the reasons she was selected. And she, in fact, is a rancher herself from up on the Rocky Mountain front. But I don't think you'll see that really extreme policy being driven by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on this. And it'll be interesting to see if these bills make it through the legislature, which I suspect they will, if the governor signs them. I wouldn't take it as obviously, I doubt he is not going to sign a bill that his own department came out against, but we'll see.
I'm in Colorado. The compensation claims are being abused. Most of the $343,000 is going to one rancher. That's after this rancher has received more than 800K from USDA. Well, I'm in the wrong business.
Yes, and the Colorado state wolf policy is in dire need of reform. Their compensation for ranchers is entirely over the top. They have a 7 times multiplier. These latest compensation claims included compensation claims for things like livestock weight loss due to stress and reduced calving rates when they couldn't even prove that there was a link to wolves. And it was up to the commission to say, hey, no, this is ridiculous. But they just went along and just gave the ranchers everything they asked for. And that's a big mistake. When you look down in New Mexico with what's happened with compensation programs from federal agencies under the livestock indemnity program, what we're seeing is that paying off large sums of money to ranchers for wolf depredation losses is just leading ranchers to create fraudulent claims. And there was an investigation. We got a tip off from Wildlife Services. So we did an investigation, and that was put out by The Intercept in 2023 as a major report that showed that some of those ranchers were filing false claims, and Wildlife Services was simply rubber stamping them as real on very little evidence that wolves were ever involved in any of them. And in some cases, those depredation claims and those losses were being used as a justification to wipe out entire packs of endangered Mexican wolves. And so you've created a perverse incentive to inflate the livestock losses, blame the wolves, and then turn around and wipe out the wolves for losses that probably weren't due to the wolves in the first place. It's fundamentally unjust. It's unjust to the wolves. It's unjust to the taxpayers. It ought to be more rigorous. Oregon just passed a state law, and Adam, I know you are active in this, and it increased compensation to a 3 to 5 times multiplier, which is objectionable enough. But it does not allow, for instance, missing animals to be claimed as losses to wolves. That's not the case in Colorado. So a lot of these different states need to tighten up what they're compensating for and put the burden of proof where it needs to go on the state agencies that are doing the depredation investigations, and let them do rigorous necropsies, because it's easy to tell if an animal has been killed by a predator because it will have a lot of arterial blood in the kill site. Many times wolves and other predators are scavengers too. If the animal has died from a lightning strike or from a disease or from some other cause, and the wolf comes around and scavenges it, you won't have that arterial blood on the kill site. And that needs to be done in a rigorous way. Right now, these agencies, whether it's the state agencies, the federal wildlife services that are investigating these depredation claims, are more often than not just trying to go along to get along with the ranchers and just going ahead and in each case saying, okay, that's a wolf kill because we found some wolf tracks. And that's just not good enough.
If Nick can put on his journalist hat for a moment, I'd like to hear his thoughts on how to bring these issues to the national audience and whether he thinks it would make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, again, I think there is a lot of value in that, again, talking economics, talking about what we're getting out here, and talking about we on these federal public lands value native wildlife out there. So yeah, I mean, I think those efforts are underway. Certainly that disgraceful incident of a wolf tortured in a bar got a lot of attention, but we need to keep that up. And
Suzanne,
take it to the east, take it to, take it all around the country too. I mean, people know about these, but it's this whole notion of the people.
Oops.
I guess Nick took his journalist hat off.
On the coast should. Uh-oh.
You're back.
I was just, yeah, sorry. Um, I was just going to say, given this push to take over our federal lands that we're seeing from the Trump administration or from the states, a great message is to say, if this is what they'll do with your public wildlife, imagine what they do with your public lands.
Hey, that would be a great next webinar idea. Talk about privatization and selling off. So I'll confer with Erik about that. All right, this is for Suzanne. What are the most effective non-lethal methods of livestock protection?
Oof, boy, it depends on the type of livestock and the location. So, where are you talking, and how many? And so let's see, if you're going to be talking about like just a range situation with cattle, human presence is extremely important. Um, yeah, I would say that though we just saw this report come in from social media today that one ranch in Colorado has had the same wolf there for 10 nights in a row. They've been capturing it on video camera. So it's on a private ranch. Most of the time when we see a problem starting with wolves, it's because they're being attracted to a particular place. My guess is that there is a dead pit or carcass pit, what they call, where they pile up their livestock. And like other situations that have happened in Colorado, the wolves are enticed, they're attracted by these carcass pits or these dead pits because they're scavengers as well as predators. And it's much safer for a single wolf to scavenge his dinner than it is for him to try to kill an adult elk or moose or even a deer. So we need to get rid of those carcass pits for one thing. We learned those lessons the hard way in the Northern Rockies. We shouldn't need to learn them again in Colorado. And, that's something that Oregon installed very early on, is that carcass management was a requirement for there to be any compensation before anyone was able to even consider being compensated. They had to show that they had cleaned up those carcass pits and they weren't attracting wolves there to begin with. Beyond that, there's just so many different tools that we have. They're coming in from all over the world. Fox lights from Australia. We've got electric fencing that does really well. It really is situational. So there's really great opportunities for, addressing these problems proactively. It's harder to do it after there's already an ongoing problem. And that's another approach that I think that Colorado has really dropped the ball, because there's not a requirement in the state for ranchers to use these methods proactively. And they can still qualify for compensation, even though they haven't done anything to protect their livestock. And that is a disincentive. It's a perverse incentive, is what Erik was saying earlier. And it's just going to work against the state. It works against the wolves, and ultimately it really works against the ranchers as well.
Thanks. This is for Erik. Why not let wolves and carnivores manage bison, deer, and elk? We really need these animals to help control diseases like CWD, They are now using dogs to find CWD in deer. If dogs can do it, wolves could do it better.
Well, there's no doubt that natural predators are far superior as a means of cutting CWD out of the herd than anything else we've got. And there have been some studies up in Yellowstone that have modeled what that might look like, and they have found that wolves are very likely, our most effective form of defense. There's also a study that was done in 2009 on mountain lions, finding that mountain lions do a pretty good job of identifying diseased animals they're carrying CWD and taking those out of the herd. Here's the difficulty that we face in the absence of large carnivores. If you have a hunted population of mule deer or elk or moose, and they're starting to get infected with chronic wasting disease, the human hunter is not going to notice the weak animal. And if the human hunter does notice the weak animal, it's in his or her best interest not to shoot that animal, because that's tainted meat that could then infect that hunter. And there are probably already hunters that are dying of chronic wasting disease and having it misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's, quite frankly. And so the human hunters are never going to be able to control this disease. Elk or wolves and mountain lions and other large carnivores, on the other hand, seem to not be affected by chronic wasting disease, and they will go after those animals that are a little slower, a little weaker, losing a little bit of their cognitive function. Those are the animals that are early stage chronic wasting disease. And if you can get those animals out of the herd before they progress to that drooling stage where they're reinfecting other members of their herd, then you can slow the spread of the disease. And that's really our best chance. So the questioner is right. I mean, clearly these large carnivores are critical for disease prevention and trying to limit the spread of things like CWD.
Thanks. We're getting close to probably wrapping it up here, but if folks want to stick around maybe for another 5 minutes, we'll get through a couple more questions. Would that be all right? You stated, I'm not sure who the you is, but you stated that livestock has incredible strong lobbying power. Why can't all the various pro-wildlife organizations come together for a strong, united lobbying presence?
I think that was me that made that statement. Largely it's because we're not selling millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of beef at the store and hiring huge marketing companies and very well paid lobbyists. We don't have the funding that industry has, and that industry is being supported by its consumers. So, that's a kind of vicious circle there. We do work together collaboratively, but I think that even within the NGO community, it is fairly dysfunctional in terms of how we're set up with nonprofits in this country. There's often a real pressure. I've worked for little groups and I've worked for really big groups before. There's a lot of pressure, especially with those larger organizations, to fundraise at all costs. And they're always trying to stay above and gain, and that becomes really a huge part of the mission. It takes over in some cases the ability to collaborate with other groups. I really appreciate working with Erik and Nick and the folks at Western Watersheds, because we kind of wrap our arms around and link at the elbows together, and it definitely makes us stronger. But it's not easy to do. So big shout out to you guys, and I'm sorry that Julian wasn't able to join us tonight, but I wanted to also do a shout out to the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce came, the Nianipu came and helped us when the state of Idaho walked away from the table early on when we were bringing wolves back. It was the Nez Perce tribe that came forward and said, well, if the state won't help you monitor and manage wolves, we will. And they were there day in, day out, doing the monitoring, ensuring that wolves were surviving until the state took back over, and the state has essentially cut them out of that process since 2015, when probably 2010 even. So, I think we've got to give more acknowledgement to the indigenous tribes that they really have a right to be the stewards of these the species and our public lands as well. So, if we get the opportunity, when we get the opportunity to roll out Senator Booker's tribal heritage and the American Bison Grizzly Wolf Coexistence and Conservation Act, I'd say that's one of our best hopes, because that gives permanent protection and it permanently puts the tribes into a high role as a true and proper steward of both the lands and these species.
Well, thanks. Well, speaking of fundraising, I just dropped the link into our donate button if you'd like to contribute to WWP. And also, if you would consider supporting the organizations that are represented here tonight by our panelists. Also, we have a conference in Salt Lake City. It's called the Healthy Public Lands Conference. And the Wildlife Coexistence Network and Sierra Club are sponsors along with WWP. I dropped a link there. We'd love to see you in Salt Lake this May. I believe it's the 28th through the 30th or so. All right, so one more question. Let's see. Do any of you have a read on Brian Nesvik's likely approach to wolves in the ESA if and when he is confirmed as director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
I'll jump in on that one. I mean, first off, Brian Nesvik is going to get confirmed. There's no question about that. He was specifically chosen because of the grizzly issue. I think it was Senator Barrasso who really picked him, and that shows that delisting grizzly bears and managing for bare minimum numbers is an absolute priority. But I think it's going to be awful. I mean, I think they're going to bring that Wyoming model to the nation, and you will have a really hard push on this national wolf delisting and bringing, again, he's going to bring the Wyoming model to the country, and I think it's a very sad day when that happens.
All right, thank you. Any other thoughts about Brian?
Just that if the state of Wyoming can't stop itself from crushing predators with snowmobiles and showing them off in bars when they've had the opportunity for a year now to be able to pass that legislation or even adopt policies within Wyoming Game and Fish, that's who we're looking at is taking over the wildlife policies in the country. It is going to be a long fight.
And it's the official policy of the state of Wyoming to not list species under the Endangered Species Act, and that the state should be the steward of its rare species. But with wolves and with grizzly bears alike, we've seen what the state of Wyoming does when it gets the ability to manage or influence the management of these species. It's trying to eliminate them. So I don't think that we should be seeing a director of a state agency that has personally voiced anti-ESA, Endangered Species Act viewpoints appointed to the agency that administers the Endangered Species Act. It fundamentally is a move designed to undermine the ability to protect and recover those species that are on that list for the reason that they're close to extinction. And he's there also to prevent other species from being listed as well. So I think, I don't have very much room for hope that we're going to get anything but, a railroading of rare species under Brian Nesvik.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? I also, Wyoming doesn't manage anything well. I mean, their management of elk, and those of you who are familiar with the feed ground issue in Northwest Wyoming, is a train wreck that has been predicted. There are herds of mule deer in Wyoming that are 48% CWD positive. Even the state of Idaho has a statewide target of 2 to 3%. And you're not going to hear me say wolves can eradicate CWD. That's not realistic, but they can certainly keep prevalence rates much lower, and by selecting things that Erik touched on. But this idea that states can manage it, Wyoming is a train wreck of wildlife management, period. I'm saying this as an elk hunter. And we're gonna pay a price on our public lands and wildlife and waters for this. That's just a sign that elections have consequences.
I'm a hunter as well, and we're paying the price with CWD. Like we need healthy predators out there. I just dropped Suzanne's website and donate link in the chat also a link to Jimmy Tobias's new project. He's a investigative journalist, and he's really doing a great job digging in on interior. Please stay tuned to all of our social media channels for updates on the Trump administration nominees and all these developments that are just making all of our heads spin. And I think that's the point, but we're trying to keep on top of it. So there's a lot more questions. I really appreciate everybody asking. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody on time tonight, but we will be releasing the recording of this webinar, so stay tuned. And thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us this evening, and have a nice night.
Very much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.